And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul Dirienzo. Got another great show in store for you live here on MNN. My guest returning again, Andrew Tatarsky, harm reduction psychotherapist. We've had him on a few times to talk about harm reduction. And if you've never heard of harm reduction, it's time to hear about it. You know, Andrew, a few days ago I went to the cannabis business conference and business exposition that was at the Javits Center. I probably just mangled the title, all these long titles, but it was the second annual, and it was interesting to see all the businesses and all the accoutrements that have been spun off by marijuana legalization. I mean, there were scientists, there were grow experts, there were different ways of smoking it. There were financial analysts, advisors. They had one company that sold a metal safe that used your thumbprint where you could keep your stash at home if you were a medical marijuana patient, and therefore your kids couldn't get at it or something like that. It was pretty amazing to see the wide variety of products that were coming out of Colorado and Washington and the states that have legalized marijuana. And at the very beginning was Ethan Nadelman, our friend from the DPA, the Drug Policy Alliance, who spoke about their number one focus, which is to legalize marijuana in California. That's but he also said that it wasn't for them, for DPA, it was never just about marijuana, even though that's their major focus. And he started talking about harm reduction. And he looked towards, and he put it in a broad perspective, harm reduction as far as addiction, but also harm reduction as far as the going to jail and the criminal aspect, because in California they overturned. He said even though they lost the marijuana legalization vote, the last time they actually got through a motion that ended 3 strikes you're out. So that no longer exists in California. So you can't go to jail because you jaywalk 3 times in a row. You know, 3 strikes you're out was very serious. They also have one as far as crystal meth versus not crystal meth, crack versus powder cocaine, and the disparity in sentencing has been ended, and in California at least, where now it used to be that if you had crack, the same amount of cocaine in the form of crack, you get way more jail time. So it seems that harm reduction's on the march.
Well, I think harm reduction is on the march. And I think we've made tremendous strides over the last 10 or 15, 20 years in increasing acceptance of harm reduction at every single level. Currently, essentially this is because the data on the failure of punitive drug law and punitive abstinence-only treatments failure is coming in globally.
Right.
And the public is beginning to wake up, and the politicians are beginning to wake up to the fact that the drug war has failed abysmally, and that we need to take a whole new health-related approach to drug use.
What is a health-related approach? Because people would say in the past, well, don't do drugs and you won't have a health impact. I mean, why isn't that argument holding water as much as it did traditionally for so long?
But the fact is that it's just simply not realistic. It's simply not pragmatic. Humans will engage in risky behavior. Humans go skydiving, and they go backcountry skiing, and they drive, which is
much more dangerous than a plane.
That's right. It's a potentially lethal activity. So, in fact, humans engage in risky behavior, including the use of potentially harmful drugs. And so, aside from drugs, we're already practicing harm reduction in most other areas of our lives, or other areas of risky behavior. And we're now beginning to recognize that we need to accept that humans...
We wear seatbelts.
Many humans will use drugs and engage in other potentially risky behaviors, and we need to shift from an unrealistic abstinence-only approach, which doesn't work for a variety of reasons. That
seems to bring a lot of money into the police agencies of the country, because we had Jack Cole of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition on the show a few weeks ago, and he was telling about how when he was an officer, or a narcotics officer in New Jersey State Police, how much money he used to bring in, and by doing that.
Well, Yeah, you know, we have an addiction as disease, which then gives rise to an abstinence-only treatment approach, which is currently in this country a multi-billion-dollar industry, which basically fails abysmally to help the majority of people with drug use problems. And then we've got a multi-billion-dollar criminal justice industry waiting to pick up the pieces. So we need to transform drug policy on the political side, moving toward more of a focus on drug use as a health issue, and we need to transform the addiction treatment industry toward a harm reduction framework.
Well, how do you do that when you counsel somebody who has who comes into you? You know, don't be specific, but let's say folks come to you and they have a drug problem, but they don't necessarily want to quit drugs. They just want to get control of their drugs. Is that how it usually presents itself to you?
Well, it presents in a wide variety of ways. People who are concerned about their drug use don't typically begin to think about stopping. Although many people who are struggling with their drug use and becoming clearer about what's realistic for them come to accept at a certain point that abstinence is the best goal for them. But they don't necessarily, and many people actually come to recognize that they can moderate or they can develop safer use patterns. But at the beginning of a process of becoming aware that you're concerned about your use, people tend to be unclear about what they need to do.
Right.
What goals make the most sense for me? What approach to positive change do I need to take? So what the harm reduction framework does is it shifts from requiring people to do something from the beginning of the process, typically to abstain, to meeting people where they are, creating a supportive context that actually supports people in taking a closer look at their use, look at their options, and working toward greater clarity about what goals and what approach make the most sense for them. So basically a harm reduction framework opens the door to people to begin working on their issues wherever they're ready to begin.
What are the first type of questions you ask somebody? What do you try and find out about them when they come in? What's the first thing when you have a new patient you try and find out?
Well, the first question is, how can I be helpful to you? Which is a very simple but a very powerful shift from what many drug users are met with when they walk in the door, which is typically, this is what you have to do, and I'm going to tell you how to do it. And if you don't do it my way, you're not ready for help.
Really? I didn't know that.
I mean, that's
I've avoided this.
That's the hardest line version of that, but most traditional approaches to drug use problems begin with a presumption about what the nature of the problem is and what the drug user needs to do. And my view as a clinician working in the field for 35 years is that when we begin a helping process with a presupposition about what somebody needs, it's going to derail the process from the beginning.
I see.
So what the harm reduction frame does is it shifts it to a commitment to meet the individual without a presumption about the nature of their problem, so that we can actually invite people to actively collaborate in discovering what their issue is about.
Do they tell you their drug stories? Do they tell you where they woke up? Or do they tell you how they do it, what they go? I mean, I've sat and just heard people tell stories. Professional drug users, right, can really amaze me with how much they know about what they're taking.
Absolutely. So the shift from a traditional disease model view of addiction, that is either you have it or you don't.
Sure.
We're shifting to a whole different way of understanding drug use.
I see.
As existing on this broad continuum of severity, but also that there are benefits, which is why many people use drugs in the first place, as well as risks. So after we ask, how can we be of help, we then can begin this collaborative exploration of the nature of people's relationship to a drug.
Well,
and that relationship is generally very complex.
People used to drink radium. If you know what I mean. I mean, back in the day.
No, I don't know what you mean. Tell the audience what that's about.
When radium was discovered and it seemed to work on some cancers before they understood what was really happening, people thought, oh, this is a wonderful glow-in-the-dark elixir. It'll make it healthy if I just drank it, and it became a wild fad throughout society where people were drinking it, radium, and ingesting it in all different ways and putting it on their skin and marveling at how they glowed in the dark. The point being is that sometimes when we start out, there's so many drugs that are legal out there that are dangerous, and yet there's so much focus on this handful of illegal drugs, and yet I could point to all the drugs in the pharmacopoeia that are way more dangerous than almost all the drugs that that people allegedly abuse. Yeah. So that was what I used to amaze me, is how do you judge what is a good drug and what is a bad drug, except by what's illegal and what's not illegal.
Yeah, so once the distinction between legal drugs good, illegal drugs bad breaks down.
That's the distinction I'm talking about. That's the craziest distinction.
Because you may know, and I'm sure many of your viewers know, that the largest epidemic of problematic drug use right now is the use of prescription opiates and other prescribed drugs. So, the evidence is becoming glaringly clear that there are no good drugs and bad drugs, but that we could consider that each drug has a risk-benefit profile.
Yeah.
And to complicate matters more, that varies from person to person.
Right.
So that our job really as helpers or as citizens is to figure out for ourselves, what are the particular risks of a given substance for me? That's what we want to do, want to help people with as harm reductionists. And the way to do that is to take a close look at your own experience with that substance.
Well, let's look at marijuana, for example, because marijuana is often presented as the most harmless of all the drugs, and nobody's ever died of it as far as we know, and it doesn't seem to be associated with any really super bad sort of things, although some have said, oh, it makes, if adolescents get it, they don't want to work, or, it's too much of a party drug or whatever. People party too much, they're not focusing on what they're supposed to be focusing on. Maybe it's that kind of thing. But do you really have to deal with one of these profiles with marijuana, and how would you do that with somebody?
Absolutely.
Then we can try a hard drug after that.
As I said, each drug has its own risk-benefit profile.
Yes.
So some drugs have much more severe, obvious risks. Right? Marijuana doesn't happen to be lethal. And for many people, it is a very beneficial substance in a variety of ways with no downside at all. But there is a percentage of people who develop a variety of pretty severe problems with marijuana. Overuse of marijuana can contribute to real problems in functioning in every area of one's life.
Right, it becomes and that's a strange thing about addiction.
Now that's a small percentage of folks, of marijuana users, but it is a significant issue for some people.
That addiction that it's not just drugs that people become addicted to, but all these other addictions. I mean, can you become addicted to food? Can you be addicted to writing with a red pencil? Can you be I know people had to write with a red pen all the time. It was crazy. It drove everybody nuts.
Well, back up 1 second, because here we're now moving into territory that has to do with changing our understanding of addiction.
That's
from, biological disease, which would more obviously seem to be linked to substance use, to much more of a complex process. I call addiction a process or an experience and behavior that has biological, psychological, social, cultural factors that contribute to it. So if we think about the experience of addiction as feeling this over-involvement with an activity, attempting to get something from it that it doesn't deliver, where there's craving and there's this kind of obsession with the activity.
Craving seems to be a key one. Every waking hour thinking about getting it,
or whether it's every waking hour or it's just occasionally that experience kicks up for you. Then we can see that experience can apply to lots and lots of different behaviors, including work, including
Workaholics.
meditation.
Okay.
People talk about spiritual bypass, whereas when people are using meditation to avoid...
How about running?
Running.
I've seen that. Boy, I've seen people run themselves into this major surgery, and like they can't stop. I mean, I'm saying you have like 5 knee surgeries already, and you're running another marathon. What? And then people tell me that you get an endorphin, you get a morphine-like high from the running, and I'm saying, you know, you're killing yourself. You're just as much an addict as anybody. Although you might have a much healthier heart than the average.
Yeah.
And
P.S.
terrible joints, though.
I have a bit of trouble with the term addict because it's so loaded with presumptions.
What should we use instead? What's the new word?
Person.
This is like president.
Because I think that all of us have the addictive experience at some point.
I'm thinking of our dear president saying that word on television the other day in order to shock people, and it's a word that's like a forbidden word. But addict, junkie, you know. Okay, I think of all the negative things that people. I mean, I could think of. I have a crackhead. You know, go through it all. I mean,
we accept all of these terrible, stigmatizing words as if they're fact, rather than that they're like constructions of a view of a person who's got a problematic relationship with a substance.
Well, once you say
that we
then
we put all of these other connotations. They're morally defective. They're selfish. They don't care about other people or themselves, or only care about themselves.
But they couldn't stop using heroin.
But they couldn't stop for a whole variety of complicated reasons.
Right.
Some of which are very biological in some cases.
You mentioned trauma.
Some of which are related to trauma.
Yeah, you said what is how do you define trauma? I mean, you hear this word a lot. What does that mean? I mean, trauma is like you're whacked over the head. That's traumatic, But it could be good trauma, like my dad saying, "Don't play with firecrackers," right? Don't play with heroin, bang, right? Isn't it? What's wrong with that kind of trauma?
Well, I think of trauma as a life-threatening or soul-threatening or self-threatening experience that overwhelms our capacity to manage it, to process it, to make sense of it. And that, it kind of, we have to deal with this kind of overwhelming experience in some dramatic way, shut down, dissociate, cut off, stuff the feelings to survive. So if that experience isn't in some way processed, talked about, ventilated, made sense of. Like, this horrible thing happened to me at school today, Mom, can I get it off my chest? If there's nobody there to support that child in getting it off his chest, it can remain sort of lodged in the system with all sorts of consequences for being able to feel feelings, being able to connect with other people, feeling good about oneself.
What are the kind of traumas that you deal with, just in general? Like serious traumas, or minor traumas that turn serious in a person's head, serious traumas that they can never forget?
Well, we can think about trauma as also living on this continuum from what this Buddhist psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, Mark Epstein, wrote a book that he called The Trauma of Everyday Life.
Sure, yeah, that's
so
what
that
I think.
To some extent, existential trauma, the trauma of unexpected, overwhelming loss, of being a kid growing up in a school and being the one that got picked on.
By the bullies and stuff.
Right. So that we could think of these kinds of traumas as what I think of as trauma with a little t. Or even the trauma of growing up, in a family where your parents are overwhelmed for financial reasons. They've got too many kids. They can't really attend to each child effectively all the time. So there are these kind of moments of feeling overwhelmed, feeling neglected. And then we move up the continuum to traumas that are much more severe, such as child abuse, sexual abuse.
But not everybody turns to, mainlining heroin or snorting crystal meth. Because their father beat them. I mean, we'd have a lot more addicts, considering.
Well, let's consider we have a lot of folks in this society.
And I used the word addicts again. I used it again.
Well, because it's so much in our psyches.
Right. Addiction, right? An addict, right? That's a person who's addicted, right? But what does that mean?
Let's think about a person who has an addictive relationship addictive way of relating to a particular activity. Sometimes, because this is the other neat thing about, or neat, it's another fact that we observe that challenges the traditional notion of addiction.
Sure.
That people have this experience on a continuum. Some people, a small number of people, you know, are completely subsumed by this addiction, and it takes over their life.
Right.
But other folks find that only under certain circumstances do they find themselves having this addictive experience around a substance.
When
or
something
occasionally.
recreates their trauma in their head,
When
or
something may reignite their trauma,
Yeah.
or when life circumstances overwhelm. I met a woman not that long ago who began to have a problem with drinking at the age of 65.
Really?
She had been a very fit, very active woman, engaged in lots of sports. She took a lot of personal pride. It helped her continue to feel fit and young and vibrant and healthy. And she had a serious back injury, which prevented her from exercising. And over the course of that year, she lost the thing that gave her tremendous self-esteem, a sense of identity, a sense of vigor, youthfulness. So these multiple losses, I think, overwhelmed her, and she began drinking.
Right.
And she found herself drinking to kind of stave off these overwhelming feelings of grief and loss.
It seems like a lot, because we've had folks on the show who talked about their own addiction and what they did about it, and often you do hear that story of, I was in a car accident, hurt my back, and they prescribed me pills, and I started taking the pills, and then they gave me pills to take, you know, to help me with those pills, and next thing I knew, I was addicted to pills, and then heroin, and things like that, where I have to, you know, natural.
So we might
a real gateway drug.
We might say that the current physical issue itself could be traumatic, you know, because of all the implications. But it could also revive earlier traumas, that is, earlier experiences that were kind of effectively buried, you know, kind of resonate with that current loss and threaten to overwhelm. So what happens is when these earlier unprocessed experiences threaten to come back, they can create tremendous anxiety, and people can find themselves turning to a substance to try to quell it.
Andrew Tatarsky has joined us, and he is a harm reduction psychotherapist. He works, well, he's going to tell us all about, you know, how to find out more about this and how to become informed about it, because it seems very fascinating. And you know, at this point, I almost would like to go and take some phone calls. Maybe one day we'll come back and do that, because we just don't have enough time, because I am sure there's so many people who feel this pain and have, you know, relate to what you're talking about right now. And I don't know if you heard, but today's sort of a sad day, or last night, Armand DeMille from WBAI passed away. And folks, you know, who listen must know, you know, I worked at WBAI for many years, knew Armand very well. So, you know, he was a great, these group of like people's psychotherapists, people, you know, instead of wanting to, you know, work for the man to control you using drugs or different moralistic ways of the world, this small group of fighting psychotherapists, whether Andrew Tatarsky or some of these other folks, you know, Armand DeMille and others, who have really, you know, try and... what are you guys doing that's different from the establishment?
Well, I don't know if you know this, Paul, but I worked with Armand from 1984 to 1987. He was one of my important mentors.
Yeah.
And I learned, he developed something that he called the intense feeling process, which was all about supporting people in expanding their capacity to feel, that is, to be present with themselves. And that experience of working with him and learning from him informed my work in a very, very deep way. So I really owe him a tremendous debt, and his passing is a tremendous loss. But if we go back to what we were saying about trauma, the antidote to this kind of need to dissociate trauma is to develop a greater capacity to tolerate feeling, to tolerate distress, so that little by little we can actually revisit these traumatic experiences and feel through them and give
so
them voice.
You feel these sort of questions later. Why are some people so strong in the face of stress? They can lead a platoon in battle, And others, at the slightest, the milk spilled and they're crying and falling apart and running for help. And what is it that makes people different that way?
This is one of the beautiful and mysterious things about being human. We are so unique and we are so diverse. We don't yet have the science to know why somebody is so resilient and somebody is so vulnerable. Or to put it another way, why is that first person kind of sealed off and not really affected, and another person is deeply emotionally affected by experiences? And then so there may be, we know that there's a constitutional, temperamental aspect that we're born with.
Sure.
Then mix that with a very particular family in a very particular culture with a very unique kind of social developmental history. Some families have the skills and the capacities to help their vulnerable children develop ways of managing, and others don't. So, in my view, we need to go back to looking at each individual in a very unique way.
Sure.
And so if we're going to be talking about therapy that will be helpful, we need to create a therapy that's going to help each individual discover what's true for them.
One size does not fit all in this business.
Well, that's the key. And another note to bring it back to harm reduction is to the extent that people's substance use is serving a vital function, let's say to manage, terrifying rage or to manage overwhelming grief.
Sure.
People will not want to give up the substance. People will be very invested in using.
Sure.
So we need to create therapeutic spaces where people can be welcomed while they're using the substance, so that together we can help people identify what's operating and develop alternative ways of caring for themselves, so that they can ease off.
And you see that in Switzerland,
substance.
Belgium, different places. In Switzerland, for example, there's places you can go and shoot up where you can feel safe if you have to go there or use, whatever drugs you have to use, and then go about your business for the day. They set aside places for people to do that legally.
Well, I don't know if you know this, if it's just coincidental that you mention it, but last week I was in Switzerland. I was presenting and training at a conference there of the Swiss Society of Addiction Medicine. That invited me.
Okay.
So they're very into harm reduction. And the director of that society, Dr. Robert Hemmick, was one of the trailblazers in creating what I called the Mecca of harm reduction in Switzerland. He's still currently running 4 centers in Bern.
We're coming down to the last half minute. Andrew Tatarsky, thanks for joining us. And we're just getting warmed up here because there's a lot more questions I'd like to ask you, and we just don't have the time right now. So anything you'd like to finish in the last few seconds?
Well, I'm proud to say that the Center for Optimal Living in New York City is a home for promoting, advancing the practice of harm reduction psychotherapy. We have a psychotherapy center and professional training, and people can visit us for more information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it.
Okay.
Let them talk if they want to.